Good morning to all of you. You had a wonderful session on chai kadas and sharps and all that. Today morning, we bring yet another session on spaces. The session is titled Architecture as Culture. We Malayalis are pretty used to this idea. We have seen the changing architecture around us all the time. And since 1990s, for example, there have been paradigm shifts in the way we have perceived of architecture. The Nalukettu has come back, the Nadumuttam has come back, and many other things we thought belonged to a bygone era are all back with a bang. So it is in this kind of a context that a session of this kind, where we talk about architecture as culture, becomes extremely important. And I think it's all the more important in contexts like Kerala and Sri Lanka. We have today two very eminent personalities with us. Mr. Palinda Kannangara, right? Again, interesting because Kara is something that we are all familiar with. Kara for Malayalis means shore. So a person from another shore, from another culture is here to share his own experiences regarding cultures and shores and architectures. Welcome to this session. Mr. Vijitha Yapa, he's a publisher, and I think as a moderator, I would have a tough time bringing these two perspectives together. But I think culture and spaces and architecture are areas that you yourself are very familiar with. So I'm sure that you would be able to give us your own opinions regarding the same. Now, when we speak about architecture as culture, I think we should begin from a very fundamental question. What is the meaning of culture? Can we at all talk about culture as one term, or do we speak about cultures all the time? I think that is one beginning that is very important when we talk about architecture, because architecture is constantly trying to integrate cultures. How would you respond to that?
Good. Yeah. Okay. I think if you're trying to relate architecture and culture, as you said, we should know what is culture and what is architecture, how it relates to it. So I think when I'm trying to talk about architecture, it has to be related to where I'm practicing. So where I'm practicing is like Sri Lanka. As you know, I came from there, and it's a very small country. So, but as a long history, and the culture comes from everything, and like from the group of people that as everybody knows what is culture means. If you ask, it's like characteristics of group of people, knowledge. It reflects their social background, and it's like a society that is different from the culture. So when it comes to architecture, it's like a physical evidence of the culture. So it can be like other forms as language, cuisines, and customs and religious things, all are there. So the physically, how you do your cultural, reflect your culture comes from the architecture. So if you take the Sri Lankan culture, it comes with a long history that comes from these Buddhist time, and maybe beyond that even we had a rituals and we had a civilization with that long established. But after Buddhism introduced to Sri Lanka, it was like a turning point that start developing our culture into the contemporary level. So I think it's evolved from that time. So we have a culture that is unique to our people, but it's like the same way for everyone is like that. So even if you take the Kerala or the India, it has a very unique culture because it's based on, especially Southeast Asia, I think culture based on the religion. Religion has a very big impact on culture, not like Western world. So in that sense that our architecture indirectly connect to Buddhism. So I think that's where that culture connect with the architecture. So architecture reflects the Buddhism. So that means that indirectly it's connected with that. So
But I have a question there. When we talk about Buddhism, there are also other religions. This is especially relevant in the context of India. That's why, because we are always trying to talk about one particular religion in the context of a nation. But when you have different religions, when you have different cultures and different ways in which histories have negotiated with the idea of religion itself, maybe. So, in that context, what do you feel is the role of architecture? Because you did say that architecture, in a sense, embodies culture. It is a physical reflection of a culture.
Yeah, I think as you know that Sri Lanka is not only Buddhist country, but majority are Buddhist. And that influences reflect on even the other religion. Even if you take the Muslims and Catholics and Hindu, their architecture is more adapted with the Sri Lankan Buddhist philosophy. So their architecture, even if you take a church, it's so much like a Sri Lankan church. So what is the difference is like details and how you looked at the space and how you see things are more towards the Buddhism. So it doesn't mean that Buddhism has control of the religion, no. So we have 70% of Buddhists and the other religions are equally balanced among that 30%. So you get all the religions and we have given equal opportunities for the others. But they think like in that Buddhist philosophy way of thinking, it's not extreme level. So it's happened recently in a different level. We don't know how to, this thing, it has to be settled again back to the roots and understand that we are living in Sri Lanka and we have to have that harmony with the other part, groups of people who are living there. But because my expertise is the architecture, so I can relate that all the elements to the architecture. So that's why I say I'm only emphasized because of, I'm a Buddhist, not because of that, but I can see how that influence to the lifestyle. So even if you take any other religion, their lifestyle also based with the Sri Lankan way of living. So that is the difference and that's why that is unique. So when it comes to unique or a different group of people, Sri Lanka or any other country, there's a uniqueness. So you can easily identify that when you're seeing a building, you know it's Kerala. When you see this around, it's Kerala. And when you see Sri Lankan building, it know it's Sri Lanka. So that is where we have to find as an architect, where we belong, where that architecture has to belong. Or there's some connection. It can be so many things, So maybe we can discuss further with that, how we can find your origin, what is the difference between the, from different spaces and different location-wise, how it's different. But there's an indirect way of influence that main thing as a Buddhist or anything, but it comes from a 2,500 years of history. Initially, it was start with a monastery building only, and later on, introduced different religion into the country. Portuguese came with that, and then the Dutch burger introduced, and then Moors came for the trading. So then the Islamic introduced like that, and then the Hindu came from India there, and then Hindu started, and again it comes later on. So first, I can believe the first religion that is established and record history is Buddhism. So when the other religions enter to the country, it has to adapt to that society in a way that it will be survive. Otherwise, it's going to be totally alien to that nation. So I think that's why when they're turning, even on Sunday, Mass is happening in Sinhala. It's not an English Mass. They have something that people, if they want to go to English Mass, they go to Sunday prayers for that. But they have converted that into Sinhalas. So that means they want to become a Sinhalese and part of that. And then architecture reflects totally what is there.
What Mr. Kannagara is trying to also tell us is the syncretic nature of cultures and religions. Say, for example, how it begins with Buddhism, but then different religions, different cultures come in. He's also, from an architect's point of view, I think, trying to talk about perspective. From where are you looking at these spaces? And how do you make meaning of the kind of spaces that you're trying to interact with? As a publisher, as somebody who has gone maybe into the written records of culture, How would you respond to this, this point of view about multiplicity of cultures having to be integrated into architectural spaces, Mr. Yapa?
Well, Sri Lanka is known for many things, but I think many of you will remember Sri Lanka as the land of Ravana. And he is quite an interesting figure. There's a revival of interest in Ravana. It's quite interesting. Recently, I was reading an article by Christopher Ondaatje. His brother is Michael Ondaatje, whom you may have known or you may know. Recently, the Booker Prize winners, the British decided to find out which is the best book that has been published in the last 50 years. And they looked at the Booker Prize as the criteria. And out of all the books published and which have won prizes, Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient became the best book published in Britain in the last 50 years. I mentioned that to give an introduction to his brother Christopher Ondaatje. Now, Christopher Ondaatje said that the first person to create a violin in the world was Ravana. So since we are talking about culture, it's just interesting that usually violins you associate with Germany or with Italy. But the first violin was created in Sri Lanka by Ravana. And this brings me to another interesting aspect. When the British were excavating various parts of India, they came across various buildings, they came across various things, they came across various wheels, they came across various columns. But they did not know what these were. So the British excavators wrote to a person called H.C.P. Bell, who was doing similar research in Sri Lanka. And he said, we don't know what these are. And he said, why don't you refer up the Sri Lankan book called the Mahavansa, which records 2,500 years of recorded history. And in it, there are chapters and chapters on King Asoka and what he did, and also about the Buddha. And that is how the Asoka's wheel, which adorns your flag, that the British found that is where it came from. They didn't know what it was, because that book gave them ideas on how to translate the letters that were on the columns. So it's interesting, this intertwining of culture, which affects both countries in the long run. As far as Sri Lanka is concerned, in the early days, when you entered a temple, for instance, there was a thing called a moonstone. And in it there were various figures of various animals. The initial ones had the bull also, in addition to the elephant and others. But with the invasions that came from India, the bull disappeared from the moonstones. And it was replaced by various other animals. But Sri Lanka thus became very, very famous for its Buddhist stupas. As you know, the shape of the stupas. There are various shapes of these stupas. The one near Kalaniya is like a paddy, heap of paddy. But the ones in Anuradhapura are more round. But these influence the culture and also the people. The dwellings, for instance, the Loa Mahapaya in Anuradhapura, that was built for the Buddhist monks to live. And the eldest of the Buddhist monks had to live on top because of the hierarchy. This building has 9 stories, but how do you get up there? And that is where you get mention of elevators, elevators, lifts that were used to take these Buddhist monks right up to the 9th floor. The same with regard to Parakrama Bahu, the king, where they talk about he had a 3-floor palace, and there again lifts were used to take these people up. So it's quite fascinating to see various things that are mentioned in these stories. Ravana, I won't go into the details of what happened with Ravana and the Sita story and the Rama story. But the fact is that Ravana came to India in a plane, which he had built himself. So it shows the amount of changes that were taking place. It's also the innovations that were taking place. And these were recorded in the Ramayana and the history books and the others of India. As far as the Buddhist abodes are concerned, the way that they were built, the tiles for instance, that there was space to bring in wind and air from outside, so that inside the houses everything was cool. Now unfortunately the houses are built in such a way, it's all made of mostly of concrete, and the roofs are just flat roofs, or they are made with various types of other tiles, and therefore it's very, very hot. It is quite a contrast to the type of culture and the type of architecture that existed earlier.
Thank you for that. I want to come back to this idea of spaces, because this festival is about spaces. When I was a student your age, the Kannagara was not like this at all. There were no landscaped gardens. There was no amphitheater of this kind. And there was writing wilderness actually. We used to love walking in these premises. But space has changed here. Our idea of space, for example, urban space, has changed. As an architect, how do you negotiate with, how do you look at the way in which spaces change and the functions that are attributed to spaces in different historical eras?
Yeah, I think space is defined by the people and where they live. So it's all purely to people. These buildings are housed to design or live in. And I think when it comes to space, it has changing to time. So it's reflect the lifestyle. So lifestyle is keep on changing. So we have to understand the requirements of the need, and then but understand where we are making the building. So it's very important, the context. So context, and then again where we are making the building, it's a topic. So if we know the requirement as well, so we can't just ignore the user as well, because now the people, the requirements, lifestyle, everything has changed. But if you can match the context and what is available, how the climate works, how the sun and the tropical, how you can design, that you can overcome that issues that we are having. It can have to change, but when it comes to even the material wise, there are so many ways of handle that thing. But we have to understand but the basics. For example, in the tropics in Sri Lanka or Kerala, we have to understand the sun path and then the monsoon weather and the rain, and then it can be changed, because the rainfall has changed, the weather has changed, the humidity level is changed. But we have to address and we have to make a building as well. And again, we have created so many issues with making unnecessary buildings that not for need. So I feel we have to understand the spaces, what we are designing has to be required for the need, not for greed, not like rather looking at like a places that just trying to get it, to connect that thing without using it. So I think what we are looking at these days as a building is something that is like a monumental thing, whether we are doing it for just to make it like a ego or a standout building. That is like we have to rethink when you are designing a space whether we required for that. whether how you can utilize it, whether you, and again, even when I'm designing, we try to minimize making little impact or a small impact is very important because of the context is getting losing the buildable space. So we are making now the population is getting more and the available resources are more less. So we have to find a method that we can build something using a less and but make maximum usage of the space. Maybe it can be one room that it can be multiple way of using it. And how you connect it back with the nature. In my architecture, we are always trying to have a connection inside, outside, and it becomes a quite a big space when you open out. And I feel in Sri Lanka, when you're doing something, and again, it's a very small country, we have to understand how we are just trying to use our resources and how we are going to make our impact to the nature. So we always trying to find a method whether we have anything that we can research and do something, an innovative thing, and to educate the people, trying to not to do overdo anything and trying to minimize the impact on the
I think
environment.
you're raising a very important point that we Malayalis at this juncture are particularly aware of, or at least we are trying to be aware of. After the two floods that hit Kerala recently, I'm sure both of you would know about that. We have been rethinking our idea of architecture to some extent. Do we really need these colossal, huge houses that seem to be more a reflection of our own egos than anything else? So when the Amazon forests, for example, are burning, when we talk about recurrent sand mining in Kerala, when we talk about widespread quarrying in the Western Ghats, how do we talk about an ethical architecture practice? How do we do that?
Yeah, actually, we have a duty that to set up example to the society because society is asking anything that they want. If they have money, they think they can build anything. But as a group of people involving in the industry, we can give a guidelines and we can educate people. So, for example, we had a property. It's there. I mean, like we got a client who had a property for 5 acres and abandoned for centuries and they couldn't make any building and they can't afford us so much money. And then they asked whether can you do a building that they want to go back to that village to have a reconnect with the society, where they grow up because they have a daughter. So then I was thinking whether I'm going to do an impact on that ground because it's very sensitive land. It was abandoned. So what I was thinking, trying to plan is trying to have something material that you can remove the building if they're getting the flood level is high, then they can reassemble in some other place. So what we are trying to do, and we just within 3 months, the whole building. So it is going the slide I might show which is going on. So it totally building is out of scaffolding. So the underneath the building is totally lifted and even it won't disturb the animal. So they level it. That kind of a techniques we can use it, but still there's architecture in it. So there's a beauty in it. You can frame the views, you can do everything that you're thinking and trying to do in architecture, trying to capture the view, trying to twist the building. So we may have to develop that kind of a thing as an architect and give the message, educate them. Still you can say that by doing that, you can achieve architecture. It's not trying to make a building that is like a gallery or something that people think, oh wow, it's beautiful. But it's beautiful is not, that is a building. So that is totally lifted with that scaffolding, and you can see the flood can be up to anything. This is the same building, and with 3 months we did that. And
months actually for us to really clean the house. So this idea of scaffolding, this idea of building houses on stilts, for example, I think would find a resonance in every Malayali heart. And I'm sure that there are architects here who would really maybe exchange notes with you and the practices that you have done. So for example, in Japan, how they have built houses.
it was there from our ancient time, because we have that timber building that is lifted on the ground. It's called Tampila Vihara. So the timber was lifted, and actually it's like on stone pillars, and then the timber structure was there. So it was not touched with the ground, and it's like to restrict the shrine is above your level, but still it has an idea of how to understand the termite can attack and how to lift and what it do. So then those examples are still there. Even if you take the Ambalam, it's a beautiful example I've always tried to get, because it's a multi-purpose pole, that's actual resting place. It has a four-plinth kind of a thing. You can sit, you can eat, you can have your privacy if you want to wrap around the building with saree. And but main thing is it's out of timber, and it's from that 15th century, but it's still survive because they have understand how to use the timber on a tropics and environment like that. What they have done is they place the boulders, and they lift the boulders between above the ground like 2 feet, and that became the sea level, because your feet is on the ground, but you can reach 2 feet above. So you sit or you can eat. That is designed for a resting place. So it's a beautiful design, and actually it's not only the design, it's about how they understand the material. So it's a very good example we have to understand from the past, and then we can bring back with the new technology, with the adapt to the new lifestyle. So it is that our task.
It's a fascinating idea. I particularly like the way you were speaking about water flowing through the house without really disturbing ways of life that we practice within the house. It's fascinating. One thing that I wanted to ask you, Mr. Yapa, when I was listening to this, are there any texts on architecture in Sri Lanka? Like we have our Vastu Shastra and things like that. So are there any texts that speak about, more ethical practices, maybe from an early
which is the only feature film made in the world in the pidgin language. Now, this country has 1,000 islands, 700 tribes who speak 600 different languages. And there are only 2.5 million people. What are our problems? Whether it be India or Sri Lanka, you see 1 or 2 languages and we are fighting. But here is a country which is trying to integrate itself. Now in this country, how do you get people who speak 600 different languages to understand each other? Because the people who are living in the next village don't know how to communicate. And cannibalism was quite rampant. I met one man called Symbiotic. He killed a man. He was given 3 months in prison. The second man he killed from another tribe, he got 6 months. But that's the way it goes. Because one of the problems is that you don't have the evidence. The evidence is all hidden. So how do you then find out what has happened to this man who has killed him? But that's not the point. I'm talking about the language and how they discovered how to bring these different people under one language. And that language is called pidgin English. How do you describe to people who have never seen any objects which are available freely in the West that this is what it is? I'll give you one example. Piano. If you say piano here, everyone knows what a piano is. But how do you explain to people who have never seen a piano what is a piano? So the word for piano in the pidgin language is E black pela bogis. Suppose you fight in white pela beat, it cry out. I'll tell that slowly so that you understand what it is. E black pela bogis. It is a black box. Suppose you fight it. Suppose you hit. White pela black pela teeth. White and the black teeth, E cry out. It sings out. So immediately in your mind, there is a picture of what this particular thing is. So that is the type of thing we need to learn, because there they have created a country which has this particular language, pidgin, as the official language of the country. They have taken the designs of the houses, for instance. And you go to say places like Turkey, you see the way that innovations have been done. Not just copying the Western things, but also adapting it so that the people also identify themselves with it, but they also want to integrate with society.
600 languages, at least they accept that there are 600 languages here. We are fighting for that kind of acceptance. To come back to the issue of spaces and of architecture, one important question that I wanted to raise is, I think you mentioned it at some point of time. We are also talking about a building is having a certain kind of an identity which is in flux. So how do you take into consideration things like gender? Because in Kerala, we have had maybe at this point of time obnoxious practices like women being separated during menstrual time, things like that. The kitchen, for example, being largely considered as a female area of interaction. So how do you at all have gender in your consciousness when you think about an architectural space?
Only had one room. There was no one room for families who live in separate rooms. So what they have done is they have given a center whole house for the women. So that means society has given a significant role to the women. The men has to sleep outside the house. So that is called veranda. So we used to have a veranda and a room. Room is to take care of the kids and the women. So they are secured by the people who are outside or sleeping as veranda. So as the veranda becomes connected point for the daytime where they can cook and they can talk and they can sit, that is a living space, that is a multicultural space. And in the night, women goes inside the room and it will really dedicated space to the women. So that means that our society has recognized the importance of the women and given that space. So from that time, I can see that it has developed to different level, and now it's like requirements of having a different kitchen and the room and different function. You can have the library, and but I think even it's in architecture we have a really big role for the women. We could just consider them as important as the other part in things. You can see that when I say that example, and I think one of the slides is showing that room where how the people are living and the veranda and how the veranda can be a multifunctional space. Only thing is nowadays it's like, as I said, that's not designing for the need. It's like designing for to get attention and trying to get the demarcation, like stand out from the rest of the people, to show off their wealth or something. So I think that we have to change. But your question that you asked is whether the women, the gender, how we handle. I think we won't feel that is as a something because it comes from our history and examples how we given to the society. And society has defined as a very important character in that species.
In India, and specifically in Kerala, of late, we have increasingly become preoccupied by notions of privacy. And that especially is very important in architecture. So these ideas, say for example, spaces were much more public earlier, where we had public interactions where we could, and privacy was not a commodified kind of an object. Now privacy is very much a commodified artifact in today's world. How do you, as an architect, address
The notion of privacy or the dichotomy between the private and the public.
Yeah, actually, it's very important when you're designing for a client to understand their lifestyle. So what I'll do normally is to meet the client to understand their way of living, and it's a person to person is different. But privacy is common for everybody. So what we normally do is like we do buildings that is more open, no grills, maybe no curtains even, but that is more like a selected area that you more can like a ground floor, and it will be always like a connected with the outside world. But when it comes to the upper level, that is like more secured and more closed, and you can have your privacy and you can control your privacy, and you can have a double layer that you can filter that what you're looking out and whether they can see you in kind of a thing. So what we're trying to do is give more secured and more private places as a, there are some selected area in the upper level. So in that way you can mix that same, the feeling of having the public space at the ground level, and it's like a pavilion. So it can be totally open even. So in that way we can do a totally different design. So because ground level is totally open, so you leave it like a garden pavilion that is connected with the garden. So most of my design is like that. So some people is mostly for the for a seminar like lectures, they'll ask you, where's your grills? What happened is there's no grills, there's no curtain. What happened is the mosquitoes. What we're trying to do is we're trying to have a secured space at the upper level for bedrooms, and there are private areas, lounges, and then it's more like a secure. Then you have a totally lockable doors, you can seal it. If you want to have a air conditioned comfort, that you can have that. But ground level, I'm trying to keep it like that is going to be the public space, that is going to be the interaction space. That more like a garden pavilion is almost like a living with the nature.
When we talk about the ground level and the upper level, maybe we are also talking about it from our positions of privilege, from our positions of class. How do we address this issue in architecture?
Yeah.
Like, say for example, for lesser privileged people, people who cannot afford the kind of luxuries that are being debated here today.
I think we have to look in another way. People who have in a big land, I think it's having a more money than having a small land, because what we are talking about it, people may not able to purchase a 10 purchase or 6 purchase. If you have a 6 purchase, how you built your 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom house? So making a 2-story, maybe it's not a luxury now. But making a building in a 1 acre land or a 50 perches or something is like a luxury now. So we are talking about people who are not having money but who can build something in a very small footprint. And then again, we are going back again to say that whether we are making a footprint less. So we want to think about how the carbon footprint we have to do it. So then I believe if you can make the building smaller, so then you can go up and one floor is not a harming your thing because it's not expensive as much as thinking buying a bigger land. So my thinking is, I think what we are getting as, and again you can make a different material of choices. You don't need to make out of concrete, as I said, scaffolding. It's a lifted one floor, and you can have an unplastered wall. You can have a load-bearing walls with that. You don't need to have a like a concrete columns to make it heavy structure. And again, what we are practicing is not a earthquake prone area. So we have to understand where we are practicing. We don't have a recommendation of having 1 foot by 1 foot columns. We have only 9 by 9 columns, so they have a standard. So we have designing for Sri Lankan context that is like more safe, and we bless with that conditions. So we can play with that material. Even we can build anything without the columns. So making a true story is not luxury. I feel what we have to understand is whatever given as a footprint, we have to build less. So I'm looking at that to keep more garden space that people can enjoy, not to make it old. But if I had opportunity to make it like quite a big rooms and a private thing, then I have like a big, like a footprint. Then I might do volumes in a different way than it's separate like that in early days. Courtyard introduced, you can separate the functions. So those actually now is gone because we may not able to have that fortunate to design in a big plot of land. We always getting a 10 purchase land, how to design 4-bedroom house in 10 purchase with all the requirements. It's impossible, and again giving a less impact to the ground.
How would you respond to that question of privacy and community living vis-a-vis your experience in Papua Guinea?
Well, I'd like to refer back to Sri Lanka, what, we, what Parita said. 2 weeks ago, I was reading a very interesting article about Hawaii. And there was a man who was told to clean up a warehouse. He went in there and he cleaned this up, but he found a lot of rat droppings and cockroaches and various other things. He spent 2 days in cleaning it up, and then when he came home, he developed a fever. And within 3 days, he died. And the doctors diagnosed that the gases that were coming out of the rat droppings and these cockroaches was responsible for this man's death. And I was thinking of the type of homes that were built in Sri Lanka in the good old days. The toilets were separate from the house, and you had to go outside to go into the toilets. Nowadays, the toilets are integrated as part of the house. So I don't know whether our ancestors looked at these sort of things and whether there are lessons we can learn of why they did it. We just take it as an inconvenience that the toilet is away from the house. But there must have been a reason. The question of cleanliness, the question of how the toilets are used. Not everybody has water. So what about the cleanliness and so all these things have also got to be looked at. And perhaps, as said earlier, we need to look at what happened in the past. And I think that way, Palita, to a great extent, in his buildings, have taken this into account. We just got a building built by him for the Sri Lanka Book Publishers Association. I won't tell you how much it cost, but the fact is that he has integrated many of the things that he talked about. There is no space for a garden. But on the first floor, he has created a space where you can have a little garden. And it's open to the sky. So that it's not air conditioned, that particular area, but that you can sit out there and you can enjoy the environment and the nature. So I think this is very, very important. That's why even this book that I referred to, I'd like to study it in more detail. But how can we use the wisdom of the ancestors? I mean, even take a thing like a roof. In the good old days, we used coconut thatching. Then, more recently, we have come into the other types of tiles and the tin, what do you call it, uh, various other types. But there are some hotels which are going back to that tradition, where they are putting asbestos, and then on top of that, they are putting the coconut thatching to make it look much more native. But they did that coconut thatching to keep the house cool. I don't know whether that is achieved by putting asbestos and then putting the things on top. But there's so many things that our ancestors did that we need to go back to those also when looking at things.
I'm sure that the audience would also have questions to ask. Can we open it up for discussion? Are you students of architecture? No. Yes. You don't have any questions to ask? Yeah.
I'm Satya. Oh, that is very loud. I'm Satya from Bangalore. I'm a student of architecture. Since you asked, are the students? This is basically to Palinda. See, I'm also speaking on behalf of the students at the moment and also on behalf of the student who's inside me. See, when you look at the kind of ethos of the local, you mentioned about the Buddhist past of the Sri Lanka, and some of us know a bit about your architecture. I've never walked into your building, but still. So how do you, now we know this whole the whole conference is also on spaces. So how does one look at the compulsion of this modernity, the modern spaces and the modern kind of form making, which is what is very often taught in the schools of architecture, and the local ethos which you are going to pick up from the Sri Lankan context? How do you actually navigate between the two? How do you actually merge the two in your architecture as a process? I'm asking, keeping the students also in mind.
I think Buddhist philosophy, how it comes to the architecture, what we are doing is contemporary world, everybody talks about minimalism, and but we had it with our practice from a long time. The minimalism comes from actually the roots of the Buddhism again. Because if you see what is Buddhism is like you have to leave everything behind. Detachment is the way of enlightenment. So we as a architect or a group of people who are living there, we had the idea about not to collect so many things. So in our architecture reflects that. That's why we remove a lot of details from our architecture. Even if you take a temple, totally there's no carvings. So, but there are influence from India to Sri Lanka. There are some more, initially architecture came from here. But Sri Lankan architecture, there's a significant difference between India is details. We didn't carve that much. We didn't want to go to that detail. We draw some paintings to get that the Jatak Katha to interpret there on the walls of the temples. And apart from that, we are trying to minimize the usage of things. We, from the domestic level architecture, as I said, very simple. And when we are doing as a contemporary architecture practice, when you're practicing, it's very easy to convince the client to understand less is more concept. Less is more start from a modern Western concept, but it's within us for a long time. So we don't want to say it's a minimal architecture, whether it's a, somebody asks whether it's a minimal architecture, I'm not saying I'm a minimal architect. I'm just practicing there, but it comes from our roots. So it's in our genes. Because, and again, we don't need to force people to say live like that kind of thing. We never can do that because people change their, when they add, on to that living and they'll start to bring stuff and make the whole house becomes like a jungle or make it like so complicated. But people initially ask whether are you forcing people to live like that or ask them to live like that. I never do that because I'm designing for the people who has that kind of in their mindset. So you don't need to teach them how to live. So if you say this is enough, this is so far you furnish, and then they live very happily with that. So I have not seen houses, maybe very few, has changed after I moved out from that, like a project. Because normally we have to leave it for them. That is their own property. So we have to design for them. But they live with that concept because that is very easy, because the Buddhist philosophy or whatever is there in our roots, I have understand the minimalism very easily. So we live with that. We are very clean in that way. We just want to have anything. And that I think gives a very much impact on Sri Lankan architecture.
It's a very interesting point because the lesser baggage you have, I think the better it is. Live minimally. Not only Buddhism, I think most religions in the world do have that kind of an austerity at its core,
correct.
at their core. So if we can try to retrieve that and bring it back into our own practices, that should be interesting.
Very easy to live like that, and you don't need to buy everything whatever you see, because you know that you design with that and you enjoy that. That's it. And again, you have to more things to enjoy than buying things and hang on the picture walls. So I think in that way you can enjoy nature. When you have more open buildings, that you have more connected with the outside, and outside change every time. So that makes it more dynamic every day. So that's how the building has to be. And again, I have to mention the Jeffrey Bauer, master of architecture, tropical modern architecture, who given us a lesson and how to make the building, and again, a robust kind of a thing came to our architecture, because we don't want to make it like a very clean building. It's not a Western like don't want to maintain, and we don't have to worry about whether the spill is there, because we design like that. If you see my office, it's designed in a way it's like age 10 years. But because it's very easy to live, because then you are very comfortable to live. Otherwise, it's like too clean to live. And maybe you have to worried about whether people are walking with the shoes, whether they are going to dirt your walls. And because the building itself look like an age, you don't need to maintain polish. Because those days, even a temple architecture is like very much like a raw material. The character of the timber has reflect on that. You can see the grain. You don't need to maintain. It's like a one whole clean building. If you take 5 times of a timber species, so you see the timber variation in color. So we don't need to worry. So that's the practice that we are doing. I'm not concerned about whether we are doing a similar type of wood, whether we are going to do similar kind of flooring, whether it has a little bit of patches. So I don't care, because it's okay. It's a beauty of it. So if you see that as a beauty, it's very easy to live.
I think on that note, that we take care to leave lesser and lesser amounts of footprints, not only carbon footprints, but footprints on our environment of different kinds, Maybe minimize the kind of baggages that we carry into our houses, the way we accumulate things, and we learn to derive pleasure out of that accumulation. We can maybe borrow a couple of lessons from the kinds of things that our Sri Lankan architects and friends have been talking about. On that note, I would like to really thank both of you for joining us today. Thank you, the audience also. Thank you so much for joining us.